Hi folks, welcome back to Dungeons and Dry Brushing. If you haven't been here before, my name is Daniel, and today we're going to be working on one of our Dungeon Basics videos, the third one in the series. The project for the third video is one that I actually said in an earlier video that I wouldn't be doing. So why have I changed my mind? I'm sure you can guess, it's dungeon tiles. The reason I've changed my mind on it is because I really want the Dungeon Basics series to be something that a new crafter can follow from start to finish and have everything they need to run modular dungeons for D&D or for any tabletop game. And if I don't include dungeon tiles, then that just doesn't work. My original reasoning was that there are so many tutorials already out there for dungeon tiles that it was simply unnecessary for me to cover it again. I have noticed since then, however, that a lot of those videos are focusing on how to make dungeon tiles bigger and better and more expansive and to put more into them, instead of using the more budget-friendly, inclusive methods that I try to use here. So, that's what we're going to focus on. I'm going to show you how to make a standard dungeon tile, both with and without a hot wire tool. I'm going to show you how to make a low-budget tile that costs very, very little to get an entire set done. And I'm going to show you what I'm working on for my next campaign that is moving to a largely gridless system and needs to mimic some interiors and designs, times and places that you don't normally see in D&D. Let's get started. This is XPS foam. And this is what you're usually seeing when we talk about our standard dungeon tiles, what we're going to be making our standard tiles out of today. So how did this become the standard? Well, it takes texture incredibly well, and it's relatively cheap. It's available most places, and it's easy to work with. That's to say, you can cut it with a regular hobby knife or a work knife, or you can cut it with a hot foam tool. You can melt it, either with a hot air gun or with a lighter, as long as you're wearing a mask, opening the windows. And it's just really easy to do a wide variety of things with it. It's also cheap. Well, it was cheap. It's 2023. Nothing's cheap, ever. Cool. In addition to that, you can buy this in a lot of different places and formats. You can buy this in great big, huge, like 8x3 sheets or 8x4 sheets. That's what I usually do. Or you can buy it in smaller sections, 1x1, 2x2 foot, that kind of thing. It comes in a variety of thicknesses. This is 1/2 inch, but it does go smaller. It also goes up to 3 inch. Depending on where you live and what you're looking for, this foam might be a different color as well. It might be blue or green. They're all roughly the same sort of thing though.
I'm going to start by working with the XPS foam and hand tools. While it's not necessary, most dungeon tiles work on a 3x3 grid system. Though I have tiles with lots of different sizes now, that's the system I started out with, and I think it's a good base point. So using a carpenter's square or a ruler, I measure a 3x3 inch piece of foam. It's best to use an Olfa knife for the large cuts. Make sure you have a relatively fresh blade and take your time. Don't try to cut through in one swipe, but rather with several slow, careful ones. That's your best bet for getting a clean edge, as well as for leaving all of your fingers in their natural configuration. The next step is adding the grid to the tile. The easiest way to do this if you're using a carpenter's square is to remember that one side of it is in fact 1 inch thick. So if you line it up with the side of the tile and trace a line, then rotate the tile and repeat, you end up with a really effortless grid. Just trace this on lightly with a ballpoint pen. Once you have your grid, it's back to your knife to trace over the lines again. You want to make shallow cuts. You're not trying to cut through the foam. You don't even really want them 1/4 of the way through. You just want very shallow marks. But don't worry if they don't look very distinct yet. The next step is to grab your ballpoint pen again, push it into the freshly cut grooves, and retrace the lines. This widens and deepens them enough to make them really distinct and easy to see. Now it's time for the creative part, adding some cracks to your tiles. Just take your pen and trace in some lines, pressing a little deeper this time. If you're not sure what to draw, then quickly Google cracked stone tiles and get some inspiration. In my experience, they tend to crack from the edges inward and at corners, so that's what I usually go with. You can add as many as you like, but remember that sometimes less is more, especially spread over a whole tile set. Now it's time for texture. For a basic dungeon tile, all you really need is a rolled up ball of tinfoil. You just crinkle it up and roll it over the entire surface of the tile, making sure to catch the edges as well to get rid of some of the sharpness of the corners and make it look more organic and worn.
So this is a pretty good start on a set of dungeon tiles, at least the technique for them. But even if some crafters don't have to worry about the expense of their hobby, something that does come up for just about everyone is economy of space. As we have to worry about just how much space we're taking up with our tiny little figures and stacks of imaginary worlds. So these dungeon tiles have another side. Why stop there?
For the second side of the tile, I like to do wooden boards. That way they can double up as the inside of buildings as well. I take a cheap wire brush. You can get these at the dollar store. I bought a pack of 3 for, I think, $3, and 2 of them have never been used. You just need to lightly brush it across the foam to get texture. The harder you press, the deeper and more rough looking the texture is going to be. To finish off the wooden boards, I just like to use the handle of the brush itself to draw on the actual boards, and a toothpick to add nail holes. I know that some people will build a grid pattern into this, but I honestly always find those patterns both too complex and too indistinct to be useful. Plus, it's not hard to just eyeball what the grid would be on a 3x3 square. So that's all the texture work done on the handmade tile. If you happen to have a hot wire cutter though, the process does become a little faster. You're basically doing the exact same thing, cutting a 3x3 piece of foam. You set your guide to 1 inch and rotate the tile to make your grid in just the same way. I will show off a different texture technique here though. I'm going to just use a texture roller on the foam rather than drawing cracks. These are available for purchase online, or if you have a 3D printer, then there's pretty much an endless amount of them for free. You want to use a fair amount of pressure to get a good imprint and just try to roll it straight across the tile. After that, I hit it with the tinfoil ball in the same way as before, draw in a few cracks, and then it's done. As you can see, the finished products are quite similar.
So that's 2 dungeon tiles done. They look almost identical, obviously with the difference in texture, not quite, and they're done using the exact same techniques with just slightly different tools. So what's the no-budget version? Styrofoam plates and a little bit of cardboard.
I start by trimming the edges off of the 2 plates just to make them easier to work with. Then I trace the same 3x3 square that we've been using for other tiles. The only difference here is that I cut out 2 squares from the styrofoam plates and 1 square from cardboard. Luckily, all these materials can be cut easily with a pair of household scissors. Rather than measuring each square individually, I just use the first one as a master and trace it onto the other materials to get the right size. One of the foam squares gets textured with a wire brush in the exact same way as the XPS foam. Just be careful because this foam is really thin and you don't want to press right through. It doesn't take impressions as well as XPS, but it's perfectly usable. The other foam square? It gets the tinfoil, just like the XPS tiles did. Again, the impression won't be as deep, so push hard. The grid and the wooden board get drawn on the exact same way too, and the nail holes get punched in with a toothpick. Again, that's something you can pick up extremely cheaply at the dollar store. To glue all of the pieces together, I'm going to use Mod Podge mixed with black paint. Now you could use PVA glue, but the reason I go to Mod Podge is because it tends not to warp materials as much. I just glue the styrofoam pieces to each side of the cardboard square. The board will give it extra rigidity and weight, which the light styrofoam really needs. I would recommend putting something heavy on it afterwards to help stop it from warping as it dries. And while you have your Mod Podge and black paint mix out, go ahead and coat all of your tiles in it. This will help with rigidity and durability, and it also gives us a dark base coat of paint to work from. Once that's dry, it's time to paint. If you've watched the other Dungeon Basics videos, you pretty much know where this is going. The stone tiles get a dark gray base. Make sure to water the paint down enough that it's easy to work into the cracks on the tiles. After that, pick out some sections of the tile to paint in other colors. I chose a lighter gray and a soft brown. On the tile with the individual stones from the texture roller, I pick out some of those individual stones instead of whole grid sections, since that's going to look more natural. Try to use these colors sparingly. If you add too many colors or colors that look too unnatural, they'll end up drawing the eye more than you'd like. But try to keep in mind too that when you hit these with a black wash, the colors are going to get tamped way down. It's a careful balance that takes a little practice. Just do your best with it. And finally, all of the stone tiles get hit with an off-white dry brush. The deeper your textures are, the better this is going to work, so the styrofoam tile makes the least use of this effect. Just treat it all like any other dry brush though. Make sure you have only a tiny bit of paint on an old, messed up brush and just lightly swipe it across to pick up textures. Before we move on to the wash though, we might as well turn the tiles over and paint the wooden boards. I'm starting with a burnt umber base coat. Once that's dry, I go over it with a lighter brown dry brush. I think this one was called Latte, but any color you like is fine. And then with a much lighter hand, I go over it with an off-white for the final highlight. And then the black wash. This is my homemade wash. It's just black paint, water, and dish soap. The more paint you mix in, the darker it's going to stain things, so try a test piece first if you're unsure. This gets slathered over both the tiles and left to dry. Keep an eye on it though and make sure it's not pooling anywhere you don't like. If it is, just use your brush to wick up the extra. The drying time may take a few hours, so if you're doing a whole set of tiles, this is a good time for a break.
Alright, so while we wait for those to dry, I'm going to try something that is less tutorial and more experiment. We're going to knock together a quick set of tiles and experiment, play around a little with some ideas for my next campaign and for the dungeon tiles I'll be using for those. I basically have no idea if this is going to work or not, so we'll find out together.
I'll be using gridless tiles in my next campaign. They also need to be evocative of classical Rome. I have tiles I can use for dungeons and the like, but I want a set that can be used for wealthy villas, the forum, bathhouses, things like that. I'm going to base coat the tiles in black paint, not worrying about the Mod Podge since I'm completely covering both sides anyway. And this is what I'm going to be trying out today. This is actually paper for lining the inside of drawers, but it has a nice marble pattern on it and it was pretty cheap. I cut it to fit the tiles, leaving a bit of overhang that I can trim off afterwards, and just glue it on with some tacky glue. And for the other side I have these. Printed pictures of Roman tile mosaics, set to be just under the size of the dungeon tiles. There's no shortage of images like these online, thankfully, so there are lots to choose from. These just get carefully cut out and pasted neatly onto the other side of the tile. When they're all done, it leaves me with a set of reversible tiles, each of which has a different mosaic on the other side, so I can add a bit of variety or personalities and setting to my next campaign through the dungeon tiles themselves. Now these were slapped together pretty quickly as an experiment, and there are some pretty big flaws, but I think it's worth playing around with a bit more. If you've done anything like this yourself and have any tips, please drop them in the comments. I'd love to read them.
Okay, so that about wraps up the crafting part of the video. So that brings us to the pros and cons and to why dungeon tiles at all. We're going to start with our basic dungeon tiles, these ones here, that are made from the XPS foam. Firstly, they're durable, they're relatively cheap to make, they're pretty easy and fun to make actually, and they're a great crafting project for beginners. Now, if you don't know how to use them, you're basically using them to make dungeon layouts. Starting with a set of tiles based on a 3x3 grid here is a great way to start off. It gives you lots of options and things you can build out with it. But you don't have to stick to that. And the more of these you collect and the more different sizes you make, you can do things like elevation for starters. If you don't have, dungeon stackers, things like that, that's what makes these so versatile. On top of that, you can even use them for puzzles like this. This is something I did to represent rising water in a campaign where a chamber was flooding. The heroes had to figure out how to stop the water, and on every turn, I just took away a tile from the stack to represent the water level rising. These have all kinds of different uses. On top of that, they're easy to store. That is to say, they don't take up much space. You can stack them in the corner of a shelf or something like that and just forget about them. I made a set of these years ago, and they're still perfectly fine to use. They've taken quite a beating on the table, but they work. You can toss them around, it doesn't matter. you're not going to damage them. As for the cons, well, yeah, they're really light. You have to be careful using them on the table. You probably are going to knock some of them out of place at some point. I know that some people like to put magnet systems into them or weights to make them heavier or to stick them to the table like the magnets, but to me that defeats the point of such a simple craft in the first place. The whole point is that I can knock it together in a few hours and it will work for me for years afterwards. If I start adding complicated systems to it, that's just not for me. I think it's probably not for most crafters. I don't think there's any huge advantage in having the most advanced dungeon tiles out there. For my money, what little money they cost, these are perfect. That brings us to these guys, the styrofoam plate tiles that we've just made today. You know, these are all right. They're actually heavier than these ones, just a little bit, which is nice. They're thinner, which makes them even easier to store, and they're extremely cheap. While the other ones aren't expensive, I did the math on these, and that pack of styrofoam plates was $2.25, and there's 40 of them in there. You can get one double-sided tile of 2 plates. If you do the math, it comes out to about 11 cents per tile. It's hard to beat that. Of course, that's if you already own the glue and the paint. If you don't, it's going to be a little bit more, but really not much more. It's still probably only coming out to about 20 cents per tile. Really, really great deal, really impossible to beat. And again, that's going to hold up forever. You can make a set of these, toss them in the cupboard, and just forget about them. You don't have to be gentle with them, you don't have to baby them. You can just throw them on the table to play. And even if one does get damaged, so what? It was 20 cents. Not a big deal, right? The cons on these ones, they don't really have the height. The stackability of the XPS tiles just isn't there, which means that it takes away a little bit of the functionality. They also don't take texture as well. As you can see, they're similar, but the impressions on the XPS tile are much deeper, much more distinct than the styrofoam tile. One unexpected pro of these might be if you're a traveling DM who's going to someone else's house all the time to run your games. These are going to be a lot easier to take with you. You could literally bring a small set of them in the pocket of your coat if you really had to. So if you travel, if you're hosting at someone else's house, keep these in mind. That brings us to the experimental tiles that we made as well. I don't really know if I need to do a pros and cons list for these, as they're not even a finished set. But I will go over it a little bit. One thing I'm really disliking about these is the thick black lines that appear between the tiles. Normally I like to paint the sides of my tiles black just because it gives it a nice clean look and kind of brings that part of the tile out of the visual range of the player. But on these, it just highlights the gaps between the tiles. I think I'll be painting the sides white in the future. But other than that, they share all of the benefits of the regular XPS tiles and all of the cons of the regular XPS tiles. Of course, I can hear some of you screaming from here, Rome did not have massive slab marble floors. Obviously. I mean, the same way that wizard castles weren't, gigantic wizard castles. European castles didn't have wizard towers. I'm not trying to do a historical recreation of Rome, but I'm just trying to invoke the fantasy of Rome, throw in some elves and some magic, and dial it up to 11. And one of the things that people think of when they think of Rome is, marble sculptures and giant buildings like the Colosseum and the Forum, and the majesty of those, as well as these tile mosaics. So I think I'm on the right track with this. More work does need to be done though. So that's the video, folks. Please, if you have any questions about dungeon tiles or about what we've done, leave them below. I'm happy to answer them. And if you haven't, please like and subscribe. It really does help these small channels more than you know. Besides, if you enjoyed the video, there is, as always, more content on the way. So thank you for watching. I'll see you on the next one.